My name is Leah George Wilson. My ancestral names are Sitsia'ama, that I got from my dad's mum, and Sialia, that I got from my mum's older sister.
Tell me about life for you when you were growing up. Were you given the privilege of being able to embrace and enjoy your culture?
I didn't really know it as culture back then. We grew up on the eastern side of our reserve, right by the water, Burrard Inlet. So we were always around the water. We learned how to dig for clams and catch crabs and use our canoes. And that's all culture, but we didn't know it as culture. It was just something that we all did. We lived right next door to our dad's older brother, so we would be with our first cousins all the time. And in our culture, although we didn't know that was our culture, we grew up like siblings. The oldest one of us, his name was Charlie, and he took care of all of us. And we'd go over to our grandparents' house, which is probably a couple blocks from where we lived, and they had a big beach, and we'd go down there and swim, and they taught us how to dig for clams, and they taught us how to catch crabs, and we watched our grandfather build canoes, and he had a garden, so we'd watch him do his gardening and watch things grow, and we didn't really know it was part of our culture.
But did you feel good about your life as you were experiencing all of this? Because it sounds idyllic to me. And you go, how fortunate you are to be in the community of family and experiencing these traditional ways around so many elements of living on the land.
I went to public school. There was still day school for people, and then it turned into parochial school. So mostly everyone went to St. Paul's School, or later in the 70s it was St. Edmund's. But our dad didn't want us to go, and our mom didn't want us to go to the Catholic school, so we went to the public school. And there were a couple other families where they wanted their kids to go to the public school as well. So one of our uncles, I don't know how he got a bus, but he got a big yellow bus, and he started driving us to the public school, which was probably, I don't know, a couple, 3 miles away from where we lived. So we didn't grow up that way with day school or residential school, although some in our community and in our generation did. So I went to school with mostly Juanitam white people, and I thought they did things the way that we did, and it was really surprising to me every once in a while when I realized that the other kids would go to places like Hawaii or Disneyland in the summertime, and we went to canoe races. We thought everybody went to canoe races the way that we did. Then, we knew that we're not the same as them. And I was far enough down the line that, there had been older cousins and my older sister who went to the school before me, so it wasn't too bad for me, but it was racist for our oldest sister.
Well, I went to public school and I hated it. I look at the school system that we have and go, it's a mean environment. Were you able to maybe navigate it better than I was?
I was really quiet, and I loved to read, so I just didn't say a lot. Stayed in the back and didn't do anything to draw any attention, so that's how I made it through.
Great strategy. I came out of the high school experience, or public school experience, with a lot of wounds. It's growing up is always challenging. But did you feel that you knew that you would go home to a loving family?
Yeah. When I got to high school, my sister had already been there for a couple of years, and Well, I mean, it's the 70s, right? So they were calling us Indians because that's what we were. All the Indians would meet up after school and we'd all walk home together. So we all kind of stuck together because it was a pretty big high school. And yeah, there wasn't a lot of diversity, so it was good to stick together. But then the way that different Native students experienced like the academic side was different. Like I stayed on the academic side and some students were pushed into, you know, doing the modified track or going to other schools where they would just learn trades. That didn't happen to me, mostly because I had a really strong mom and really strong grandmothers and our dad too that made sure that we didn't get pushed into something that we shouldn't be in.
Well, the strength of your parents also is a reflection of the strength of their connection to community and a sense of self and values, and they were able to share that with you is vitally important in anybody's development, to be able to have that kind of support at home.
It really is. Having our grandmother and our grandfather and in our community, but as well having mom's mom, grandmother in the community, yeah, it was pretty amazing. We always had somewhere to go and somewhere to be, and my mom's family was so large. When people would come and visit her grandmother, our grandmother, everybody would be there. So was the opportunity to connect with our mom's side of the family because there were so many.
Were they sharing stories? Were they sharing legends along the way? Not sitting down, okay, now I'm going to teach you a legend, but you know how things just emerge when you're in the company of those that you love and feel comfortable with. Was that happening around you?
When we would go see our grandparents, that was happening. Our grandfather still had an older brother and they could speak the language together, so they would. Our grandmother didn't really speak, she understood, and our dad could understand, he didn't really speak. So we did hear language. I wasn't a speaker of the language at all growing up, but yeah, we heard a lot of legends, and we heard a lot of our oral history and who we are, and not just like the origin story, which we did hear from when we were young, but also our grandparents lived right next to the church, and the church was built by my grandfather and his brothers because their mother, our great-grandmother, wanted a church. So we heard all the stories about how the ladies helped fundraise for the church and how all the men came together to build the church because their mom wanted the church. So it was really amazing stories to hear things like that about how the community could figure out how to do things on its own. Like our grandfather and his generation, they logged the trees from our community and would skid them down to the beach and float it down to the local mill, and they were carpenters as well, and they helped each other build their homes. They helped each other clear their land. So we didn't know that we were hearing about oral history or that we were even learning about culture. It was just the way it is.
Do you think it would have been richer for you if you had been able to fully understand your language and to hear these stories in their original tongue?
Yes, I think so, because I did start to learn language in like 1998 or so. UBC was giving a class in Hakameelam, downriver Hakameelam at Musqueam, and my older sister had gone to UBC to do a teaching degree. So she told me they offered it. So me and one of the guys I work with, we signed up, and every Tuesday and Thursday we drove over there to learn language. And yeah, it was pretty empowering, and we started to understand about why it would take our grandfather some time to think about how to translate something or try to explain something from the language into English, because the concepts are so different and people don't really understand that.
As you started to learn the language, what did you start to discover about yourself?
That I knew more than I thought I did. And when we'd go to ceremony, in our mom's family, we'd go a lot to the longhouse or to the big house and see ceremony there. So we learned, even though we didn't, sometimes they didn't always use language. Sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. So I learned what it was that I was looking at, and I learned how to understand it. So when I would go again and they'd be using language, then I still could understand what they were doing and could start to make the connections to the words. And I thought that was really powerful.
Did it also give you empowerment and enhance your self-confidence as you started to discover this about yourself?
Well, I was like 30, in my 30s, when we started to learn it properly. And the first time that I learned how to do the welcome in our language, I went to they had invited me to do a welcome to some, I can't even remember what it was, but the national chief was there and our chief was there, and I went and I had learned how to say the welcome in our language, and I gave it the best way that I could, and yeah, it felt pretty powerful.
Can you share that with me right now?
Yeah. ACMNCIA, I Tanishqualawan, E Quits Nalatst, Anthasitia Ama, Cialia, the Mana Queth, Synthalia, E Slahotiam, the Amath, Queth Ansakalot, E Slahotiam, Mitzap, Quitwilam, Tanatamuch, Tanachwelmuch, Slawatav, Humathquiam, E Skohomashoth. And then I tell people the language that I'm speaking is called Hankamitnam, downriver Halkamelam. And what I said to you was greetings to our honored guests and my dear ones. I have good feelings in my heart to see all of you. I tell them my name. I said my name, Sitia Ama Sialia. And I said who my parents are and who my grandparents are, and welcomed everyone to Hualmuk Kosalish territory, home of Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish. And also tell people that I always say my parents and my grandparents' names, because in our way it's important for people to understand that I know who I am, but also to show the family connections, because maybe there will be somebody in the audience who recognizes those names as part of their family tree, and then our obligations to each other would be different than if they were a non-relative.
That's remarkable, and it goes to show that when you change language and you change perspective, you get to share elements of who you are in a way that you wouldn't in English, because that wouldn't be a common kind of greeting that you would give in English. But by giving that greeting, you're helping to reinforce family connections, community connections, and roots to the land. It's such a beautiful way to say welcome and to honor your past and what is about to happen.
Mm-hmm. On my first week of law school, I was a mature student when I went, and I had this one class that I was late to because, we were new. They changed rooms, and we didn't know five of us didn't know where we were going, and we went to the wrong class, and they sent us to a different class, and we got there, and the instructor, the professor, had already done an introduction, and she looked at us and she said, "You're late." And we were like, "Ooh." So we sat down right wherever we were and just tried to blend in. And she said, "Well, I've already started and now I have to start again." And I thought, oh my God, this is not going to be good for me. And she's Indigenous. She was Anishinaabe, And she spoke in her language, and she did a welcome to all of us. And then she said, "Is there someone who can respond to me?" And nobody said a word. And I was sitting there thinking, well, feels like she's looking at me. So I stood up and I said this welcome to her. And then she spoke back to me in her language and told the class that what they had witnessed was our laws in action. And after that, I thought, I think I could do this law school thing.
Isn't it amazing how to be able to tap into that element of who you are and to use it as, the beginning of a belief in yourself that you can move through what would be a challenging education?
It is, and it has really helped me along the way. In my work, I have a undergrad in anthropology, and I came back to the nation to start to do some work. And as I had been growing up, my grandparents on my dad's side would always tell me who we are and tell me about our family tree and who did and who was who in our community. And on my mom's side, I think it was really just my gift, because on my mom's side, her oldest sister said that to me a couple of times. "You sit down, I have lots to tell you." And she would tell me about our family tree on my mom's side of the family. So I went into anthropology so I could understand more about all of this, and spent a lot of time growing up with my grandparents, so I understood about, well, like my grandfather was a founding member of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and his whole life's work was all about the Indian land question, to which he would always say, "It isn't a question, it's a truth, it's our land." And all his work was about how do we get that kind of recognition. So when I started to work for the people, that's the kind of work that I did in specific claims. And then when we were part of litigation, and then we entered into the treaty process, and then I was chief, and then I thought I should go to law school. And then I started to be a lawyer, and all along this route, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People came along, and people were turning back to their own languages, they were turning back to their own Indigenous legal orders, which is something that I was very interested in doing in my own practice. So I decided that I would do a Master's of Laws at UVic in Indigenous legal orders, just because my whole life path kind of just brought me there. So language is so important, and being who we are is so important, and translating those pieces of oral history, or I don't really like calling them legends or stories, because in English that word really diminishes it. It's the truth. It's our truth. So whenever we speak, we say that this is our truth. Our people aren't making it up, because to transmit oral history, it's part of the law that you say it the way that you heard it. The way that it was conveyed to you is the way that you convey it to someone else. So we all know that it's the truth, and it's not changing. And people in our communities who are turning back, or they're looking for something to hold on to, I really believe that that's the language and the culture and the way that we translate that into our laws.
You mentioned earlier the origin story. Can you share that with me?
They say that when Halls, that's the Great Spirit, that's the creator who created the world and all of the beings that are, like all of the animals and the birds and the water and the marine life. He made all of that. and he thought that he needed somebody to take care of it. And as he was walking along, a wolf ran across his path, and in our language, in our one language it's Takaya, in our language it's Stakaya, and Creator pointed at that wolf and he was transformed into a man, and he became our first ancestor. And he lived in this world and he took care of everything, but he could see that all of the animals, they had families, they had each other, and he felt lonely. So he asked Creator, how come he was all by himself? And Creator, I think it was in a dream, Creator told him what to do. So the next day he went up to a cliff and he dove off, and he went all the way down in the water, and he went so deep, like he could feel the temperature in the water change, and he scooped up sediment and things from the bottom, came up and put it on the beach, and I think he made a circle around it, and then he fell asleep, and when he woke up, it was a woman, and it was his partner. It was our mother, and she came from the inlet. And that's why Burrard Inlet, Tsleil-Waututh, our home, is so important to us, because we come from the inlet.
And so to be able to share that story gives everybody in your community a connection to their roots. And how much more important is it to be able to do so in your own language?
It would be amazing if I could do it in our language. It would give it a power that I currently don't have. We have a couple of speakers in the community that can share our origins in our language. In fact, when we went to the National Energy Board in 2014 around Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, Tsleil-Waututh had to go to the National Energy Board and tell them what our interests are in this area and why it was important for the pipeline not to be built. So my cousin, brother, Gabriel George Sitswanoch, he gave our oral history. And at that time, I was an articling student, so I translated the oral history into law. So showing the National Energy Board that we're not saying no because we don't like it. We're saying no because it's going against our laws. It's going against all of the responsibilities and obligations that we hold as Tsleil-Waututh people. We're responsible for the land and the water, and we know that those tankers are going to leak. That pipeline already leaked bitumen into the Burrard Inlet. We know that there isn't enough science to say that once there's a spill that they can really clean it up, because we experienced a spill in 2007 and it impacted our already impacted beaches and water. So when we talk about our oral history and our own Indigenous legal orders, we bring all of that together to show how it is that we're making decisions about land and water that we're responsible for and that we have an obligation to protect. We're not doing it just because we don't like whomever is in office at the time, or we're against oil production. It's so much more.
Well, when you speak about the the soil or the sediment at the bottom of the inlet that was brought up and became your mother, and you were telling me earlier about them going to dredge out more through the Second Narrows and it's gonna create those eddies, well, then that's an affront to your history, isn't it?
It is, and it really worries us about how can we stop this. We're one little community of maybe 600, probably 350 live in the community. We have some people that are out on the front lines right now, but politically we always have to be careful about how the nation government is being viewed, and we need to be working with the federal and provincial governments on all of these issues. So it's a really fine line as a nation that we have to walk.
So as you reestablish language and you strengthen appreciation of culture, does that strengthen your resolve, but also your ability to negotiate with other governing bodies or political entities? Because you have to come from, at whatever it is that you're doing, from a position of like personal strength to be able to move wherever it is that you hope to get to. So I guess what I'm asking is how important is it that you preserve the language, that you hang on to the culture so that you've got that strength of self to be able to stand up to some pretty powerful forces?
It's better with language, but because of residential school, we've been impacted and we don't have any mother tongue speakers in our community. So we've been doing all of this work without language. We can do it without language, but it isn't as rich. We can still bring who we are and bring our oral history and our laws forward without our language, but it's not as rich. And we don't have very many speakers, so we have to do it the way that we are doing it. We were really lucky when we started all of our work in the early 90s about figuring out what we're going to be doing about the land question, and having the treaty process, being new and coming online in the early 90s. We borrowed money and we started talking to our elders, because in that day we still had many, and we started talking about our land and the resources and what we used to do and what was important to us. And all of those elders had been to residential school. Few of those elders could speak any part of our language. They could understand, but they weren't speakers. And in my grandfather's generation, there weren't that many from that generation, but they could speak. So we started gathering up all the information that we could, because we knew that we're not always going to have these elders with this rich knowledge that was like opening a library. So that's where we all started.
Where do you see that we're going, collectively? Are we moving to a place of understanding and appreciation for one another, that we can have what I would hope would be true reconciliation in this country?
I think we don't have a choice. I think on each side of the table we need each other. And I think what's really amazing about the recognition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the way that the province of British Columbia has created the DRIPA, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and the UN Declaration Act on the federal level. I think we don't have any choice but to learn how to work together. And I think because of all of that recognition and the way that the court cases have gone through the Supreme Court of Canada, and how There has to be consultation and accommodation with First Nations that they don't have any choice but to work with us. And the UNDRIP, those acts bring more to the table. So we need to start understanding each other. And Senator Marie Sinclair said of reconciliation that Indigenous people have done nothing for which they must reconcile. Everything has been done to our people, and yet our people come to the table with their sleeves rolled up, ready to do the work. And that's what we're doing on our side with these different pieces of legislation that are coming forward. We're actively trying to see how is it that we can help the province and Canada realign their laws so it respects and implements UNDRIP.
I did an interview with Senator Sinclair, and he said reconciliation won't happen until the rights of one group are taken away from them, and that right that they still possess is to be able to tell and dictate what the rights are of another group of people. He says, until we get rid of that, you can't have true reconciliation. I think he's right, absolutely.
He is.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of work to be done, but at the same time, we aren't where we were.
Right.
We aren't where we want to be, but I think we're on our way.
I agree with you. You know, we have kind of a little bit of a loose agenda about what it is that we want to cover today. Of course, we want to focus on language and culture, which we touched on. But is there anything else when you take a look at your family and the example that you're able to set? I mean, look at the love in this room right now, the 3 generations of you. What does that say about the future?
My favorite story to tell is about when I was learning language and they gave us tapes, because that's how long ago it was. We had tapes. And my dad was already retired by then, and he would help me with pickup of our daughter to kindergarten. And he'd play those tapes. So he was remembering language, and Kalila was learning language. And at school, because the alphabet, I was still for Indian back then. They had a picture of an Indian with a headdress, war paint, and by a teepee. And because my daughter was learning language then, she said to the teacher, in all her 5-year-old, I know about the world attitude, she said, you know, Mrs. Radford, our Indians don't look like that. Our Indians don't live in teepees. They live in long houses, and in Indian, that's called Leitlam. And it is. Leitlam is the word for longhouse. So when we went to the teacher interview, Kalila didn't tell us that at all, because that's just a day in the life, right? We went to the school for the parent-teacher interview, and the teacher told us that story. And I'm telling you, I was never more proud of that girl than that day, because I knew that she knows who she is and how we're supposed to be recognized in the world.
Do you think that experience for the teacher changed the teacher's perspective and the way that she moved forward in her life?
I think it did. We actually have stayed in contact with that teacher, and she just, no, not that teacher, was the next teacher. But I really think it did, because we were in that age, that was the late 1990s, so we're in that age when people are becoming more aware of Indigenous issues. So I'm really hopeful that it did. But when Kalila got to grade 1, that teacher was really understanding and more accommodating. And when she was in grade 4, she did a project. She had to do a project on I think it was her family tree, or it was about being Indigenous. And she brought my dad to school, her grandfather, and he used to have gray hair and these little braids. So he would be the one going into the school with her. And I think that helped as well. Because, you know, the excuse me, the children were seeing more diversity.
How do you see the future for all of us?
Well, I think the government will work with the Indigenous people on the alignment of laws so that provincial laws and the federal laws come in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I think Indigenous people will do their own work on their own Indigenous legal orders, and I think in doing that work, we'll bring out culture and language, because in our world, it's all connected, and that will bring healing.
It's a nice note to end on, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's great.
Really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, let me unclip that microphone. You're amazing.